So these are your notes on what is life. We've already covered this a bit in the What is Life lab from the very beginning of the class, but we need to study life because biology is the coolest subject in all the world. That's it. Um, it's also important to know what it means to be alive. If we're going to study life, we need to understand what it is. And just one quick thing: living things are called organisms, and they're whole complete entities that can carry out all the life functions on their own. So an ear, not an organism. Red blood cells, not an organism. They're parts of organisms, but they're not an organism. And Louis Pasteur over here, hidden behind my picture, he is an organism, and we're going to learn about him later in the year. Okay. Let's see. Next, we've got characteristics of life. All living things contain cells. That's the first thing. Okay, that's the number one thing. If it's got cells that are doing things, it's alive. Okay, they're the smallest unit of life. You can have living things that are just a single cell. They can be self-contained and take care of themselves. Think of bacteria or protists that do that. Um, but organisms can be unicellular, which is just single cell, or multicellular like us. We have lots and lots of cells, and many of them can't survive without the help of the others. They're specialized to do certain jobs, so they can't do all the jobs well. But altogether, they can stay alive. So there's a single celled, and there's the largest multicellular animal on the planet right now, the blue whale. Living things also have to be able to reproduce. Um, Without reproduction on the organismal scale, the species would cease to exist, right? If nobody has any babies, no humans in a few years. Um, but so you got sexual reproduction, which is what humans do. Two parents unite their genes to make one new critter, or asexual, where one parent just buds off a baby that's basically the same as it. It's cloning. Bacteria do that. The other thing we do for reproduce is our cells reproduce all the time. We replace dead cells. We fix wounds and things like that by um, replacing those cells, growing them in, filling it in. If we didn't constantly reproduce at the cellular level, our bodies would be falling apart in days. All right. Living things are based on a universal genetic code. If you're going to be reproducing a whole organism or even cells to do repairs, you've got to have instructions for making those things, and that is our genetic code. Um, Passed from parent to child through reproduction, and it's basically your DNA. For all intents and purposes, there's some organisms that have RNA for their code, but for humans, it's DNA. Living things also grow and develop. Mentioned this already. It's growth is an increase in living matter, so you just get bigger, and that could be one cell getting bigger and bigger and bigger, or it could be one cell becoming two, becoming four, becoming eight, becoming 16, and so on. Which is what we do, right? We start off as one single cell, fertilized egg, and that divides into two, into four, and so on until you're you right now with trillions of cells in you. Okay? Development goes along with growth, but development is changing of an organism over time. So you don't stay identical your whole life, right? You get bigger, you go through puberty and adolescence, middle age, old age. Things are always changing. That is development. So living things tend to develop, like that plant. Living things, for us to consider them living, they generally have to obtain and use materials and energy, right? We use those materials and energy to carry out our basic life process. We can't build our bodies and grow and change without materials to make us. We're made out of stuff. We get this, humans, through eating other things. We take in those molecules, we rearrange them to make, our hands or our eyes or whatever. And we use the energy found in those materials we're eating to power the making of us and to power our movements and our talk and our thoughts and all that kind of stuff. Um, so we take in materials and we take in some form of energy in order to use it to keep ourselves going. Another characteristic of life is that all living things respond to their environment in some way. You're not going to stay alive very long if you can't um, figure out where you need to be to keep yourself alive, right? Even the simplest of organisms um, respond to their environment one way or the other, bringing in more water or getting rid of salt if they got too much to try to maintain the right balance. If you get cold, we put on a coat. If an animal gets cold, they'll shiver. If we get too hot, we sweat. So we're responding to the environment all the time in order to keep us within the zone of life. If we get too hot, we die. We get too cold, we die. We get too much water in our system, we die. Too little water in our system, we die. Too much salt, we die. Too little salt, we die. All over the place. Too much or too little of any of these factors that our bodies needs, and we're going to die. So we have to be able to respond to the environment to either gather the materials we need from the environment, get rid of waste products that we're producing, or move ourselves to an area with better conditions for our lives. So in that, just touched on this in the last slide, but living things need to maintain stable internal environments. We call that homeostasis. This proper amount of water and salt, fat even in our bodies, calcium, phosphorus, iodine, iron, all that kind of stuff we need to keep in a pretty narrow range. If you don't have quite enough iron, you can't make enough red blood cells, which means you can't carry enough oxygen, which means you're too tired, which means, you get this cascading effect. If you've ever had iron deficiency anemia, that's what I was just describing. If it goes too far and you don't have enough to even make the bare minimum red blood cells, you're going to die. Okay, and so that's called maintaining homeostasis. Things like we got to keep a relatively stable temperature. If we get over 107, we're going to die. Okay, if we get too cold, we're going to die. pH in our blood, we got to keep that relatively stable. Or our chemical reactions don't work, and if our chemical reactions don't work, we don't work. Got to have the right amount of raw materials. All those kind of things. Okay, we've got to maintain that. It's called homeostasis, and it's one of the key characteristics that living things need to be able to do. All right, as a group, like humans or bears or squirrels, organisms change and evolve over time. Not organisms, but living populations change and evolve over time. Right? If you look back in the fossil record, squirrels today don't look like they did 20 million years ago or 100 million years ago. Their ancestors, they have changed to adapt to changing environments and other organisms changing. So we have to change long term. We can't evolve overnight, but we have to be able to keep up with the changes that are happening on the planet to keep the species alive. So what does it mean to be alive? These are the 8 characteristics of life that you guys came up with in lab when we did that, and we just went over. Number 1 and the most important, see if I can highlight that. Cells, made of cells, right? We are made of cells, and we're made of active cells. Now, if the cells, so active cells mean they're doing most of these things on a regular basis. If they're not active cells, then you'd be a dead organism, right? So living organisms have cells that are doing these other characteristics of life. Dead things have cells that used to do these characteristics of life. And inanimate objects or never been alive things may do some of these things, but they don't do all of them, and they certainly don't have active cells. So the other things are reproduction, both at the organism level, making a baby to keep the species going, or just within your body to replace dead and dying cells or fix wounds. We have to have instructions for how to do that, the genetic code. If you're a living thing, you're going to grow and develop. You're not going to stay the same. You're not born exactly one way and stay the same way your whole life. All living things grow and develop. As they age, all living things need to take in materials to build their bodies and use energy to move through the world. All living things need to respond to their environment, or they will die. The environment will kill them. And part of the reason we need to do that is to maintain that stable internal environment where we can survive, the right amount of water, the right amount of heat, the right amount of calcium, whatever. And lastly, if long term, not for an individual organism, this doesn't really matter, this last one, but for the continuation of life on the planet, things have to change over time. So that is what it means to be alive. Do some non-living things possess characteristics of life? No. Viruses, like the coronavirus, it can't reproduce on its own. It doesn't really take in and use materials and energy. It does have a genetic code. It's not made of cells. It can reproduce if it's in some living thing. Viruses, basically what they do is they get into your cells, they take over your cells and make your cells make more of them. Otherwise, they don't do anything. They're just a genetic code wrapped up in a box, basically. So there's a debate out there whether viruses are even alive, because they don't meet all the characteristics we've set forth for things being alive, but they meet some. It's a gray area. We're not sure. There's a debate about that. Could computers be considered alive? Artificial intelligence, is that possession of a consciousness, an awareness of self? Does that constitute alive, even though computers and artificial intelligence wouldn't have cells, and all that kind of stuff? Could we consider them alive? At what point do they become alive? Do we afford them the rights of a living thing? It's a question to ask yourself. Vampires and zombies. I don't know. Are they alive? We call them the undead, um, but by our technical definitions, I don't know. They have cells. Their cells are obviously doing something. They both seem to be able to reproduce, not in the traditional sense. They both feed on stuff. Uh, Change? I don't know. Tricky one. I'll let you debate that. When we get back and get in class, we'll talk about it. All right. And so the next thing we're going to do is a little Jamboard activity, and I'll leave you off here, guys, and catch you on the flip side.